In the darkest shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read ancient tomes. The order of the Abercast. We are the brave and bold.
The Ages begins with the shocking story of Cain and Abel and the journey of violence and revenge spanning thousands of years, following Cain through his cursed life from an ancient invasion of malicious angels to the American Revolutionary War. A masterful, compelling journey through time, The Ages delves deep into arcane knowledge, myth, and legend. The art is stunning, and the story takes you on a journey where mortals, immortals, angels, and demons are all forced to deal with the folly that is God's creation. It's a beautifully dark and gritty ride through history. This 4-part story follows the astrological procession of the ages and how each 2,500-year age parallels major changes in the development of Earth's inhabitants. Cain's blasphemous struggle with the divine and sacred tyrant God will create and crumble empires, shape history, and cause a cosmic cataclysm.
Origins of the Vietnam quagmire. Just as the space race had its roots and concerns over the Soviet ability to strike the United States with atomic weapons, so too did the disaster in Southeast Asia known as the Vietnam War. As he does for Soviet space supremacy, Eisenhower bears much of the blame for failing to address the problems in Vietnam. He failed to lead decisively in 1954 accords that ended the French presence in Vietnam. The communist boss from the north, Ho Chi Minh, or He Who Shines, had received extensive support from U.S. wartime spy agency, the OSS. By 54, most analysts agree open and fair elections throughout the whole of Vietnam would have placed Ho in power. An unacceptable outcome to most Cold War State Department officials. It is also true, however, that when the partition did take place, some 900,000 residents of the North decided to escape to the blessings of enlightenment offered by the new communist regime and headed south. Eisenhower helped entrench the view that Vietnam's fall might topple other dominoes in the region. History proved Eisenhower partially correct in this regard. After South Vietnam fell, Cambodia and Laos soon followed, but the dominoes stopped falling for a number of reasons, including the split between China and the Soviet Union that turned off the funding faucet to the North's regime. Meanwhile, even with the scant attention to the United States had paid to Vietnam under Eisenhower, the country made progress under its premier, Ngo Dinh Diem, a French-educated Catholic in a primarily Buddhist nation. Advances were so rapid that after the first visit to the South in 58, North Vietnamese Commissar Lee Doan returned with alarming news that conditions in the South were improving at such a pace that in the near future insufficient sentiment for a communist revolution would exist. Here was the communist bottom line. Their cause was only advanced out of misery, and when average people improved their lot, communism came out a loser. To ensure that progress stopped, Viet Cong, the VC guerrillas, assassinated government disease control squads sent to spray malarial swamps They killed doctors traveling away from their hospitals en route to the villages. And they killed pro-government village chiefs after hacking off the arms of their children and displaying all the impaled heads on stakes outside the villages as a warning to others. Eisenhower had utterly failed to equip and support the interior defense force in the South. Kennedy, however, wanted to establish the image of a young, cold warrior. He promised in his inaugural address that the United States would, quote, pay any price, unquote, and, quote, bear any burden, unquote, to the cause of liberty. After failing to support the Bay of Pigs invasion, Kennedy could not afford another foreign policy flop. More than any other 20th century president before him, JFK paid attention to propaganda and world opinion. He increased the funding and authority of the U.S. Information Agency, actively challenging foreign governments by market research and advertising. His Peace Corps fought communism with shovels and spades instead of guns. Kennedy's appraisal of communism was not an issue. Even after the Cuban Missile Crisis, questions remained about whether he and America had the patience to stay the course in a conflict involving international communism. The first threat in Southeast Asia had come in Laos, where Eisenhower's failure to commit troops had sealed the country's fate. Kennedy had to negotiate leading one of the communist leaders of North Vietnam to note approvingly that the American government had fallen entirely within the scope of communist strategy in Laos. That left Vietnam, and Kennedy made clear that he would not abandon this domino. When, after the disastrous decade-long Vietnam War resulted in public criticism, the assignment of responsibility, Kennedy should have been at the top of the blame list. Why he was not itself is an interesting twist to American history. Just as in later years, writers and historians would ascribe to JFK a zeal to rectify economic and racial disparities that he had never displayed while alive, so too they would later seek to insulate him from criticism over his Vietnam policy. John Roche, special consultant to LBJ, and an advisor to Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey, recalled that the revival of Kennedy's Vietnam record began in 65 and 66 by a group Roche labeled as the Jacobites. As Roche recalled, odd stories surfaced. Jack Kennedy had whispered to speechwriter Kenny O'Donnell that once he was reelected in 64, he'd get out of Vietnam. The point of all these tales was that Johnson had betrayed the Kennedy Trust and gone off into a crazy Texas-style military adventure. An alternate history having JFK withdraw from Vietnam right after his reelection had appeared. And some have argued that his strong stance prior to the election was a deception. Whether Kennedy planned to follow through on this deception or whether he ever intended to withdraw from Vietnam remains a matter of high controversy. With two recent books vigorously arguing that JFK would have withdrawn, the evidence, however, paints a much different picture. After JFK's election, American liberals running the war emphasized winning the hearts and minds of the people through material prosperity and general progress. But such progress depended on a climate of security which Vietnam did not possess. The VC were not impressed, and without American or ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam troops actually present full-time to protect villages, locals swung their allegiance and their only alternative for survival, the Viet Cong. No president did more to ensure the quagmire of Vietnam than John Kennedy. Fully briefed by Eisenhower even before the election of 1960, JFK had been informed that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had already estimated that 40,000 American soldiers would be needed to combat the estimated 17,000 Viet Cong rebels if the North Vietnamese got involved. The Joint Chiefs warned it would take 3 times that many men. Kennedy was the first to order U.S. military troops into Vietnam, not merely CIA advisors, when he secretly dispatched 500 Green Berets into Southeast Asia. He also escalated the buildup of American forces faster than any other president, so that by 1963, almost 17,000 U.S. military forces were stationed in South Vietnam, augmented by American helicopters and countless naval units, not included in the official commitment levels. At his final press conference, Kennedy said, "For us to withdraw would mean a collapse of not only South Vietnam, but of Southeast Asia. So we are going to stay there." All his principal military advisors favored not only remaining, but also increasing the U.S. commitment. Only the Kennedy image machine spun the notion that Vietnam wasn't Jack's fault. The commitment to Vietnam involved more than military forces. Kennedy and his advisors had come to the conclusion that they could not effectively control South Vietnamese Premier Diem, who had received sharp Western press criticism for persecuting Buddhists. Far from being the Jefferson of Asia, Diem had engaged in a number of distasteful practices. The extent of Diem's anti-Buddhist policies remain in dispute, but little doubt exists that he oppressed Buddhist leaders. Kennedy worried less about the actual oppression and more about the public relations image. By 1963, he was looking for an opportunity to replace Diem with someone more tolerant and malleable. So the United States quietly began searching for South Vietnamese generals who would perform a coup. On November 2nd, 1963, with full support of the United States and using cash supplied by CIA, South Vietnamese generals overthrew Diem. The coup ringleader Dong Van Mien, or the Big Mien, no relation to Ho, by the way, described by anti-Diem American reporters as a deceptively gentle man who, when spoke of the coup d'etat that lifted him into office, had a discernible tone of apology in his voice, unquote. Nevertheless, managed to make sure that Diem and his brother were shot and knifed several times en route to their exile, having given the pair assurance they would be allowed to live. Despite the administration's support of the coup, Kennedy expressed shock that Diem had been assassinated, having fooled himself into thinking that America could topple a regime in a third world country and expect the participants to behave as though they were in Harvard Yard. Meanwhile, the leader of the Viet Cong called Diem's assassination a, quote, gift from the heavens for us, unquote. It wasn't the only gift the United States would hand Ho. Kennedy's Secretary of Defense and former Ford executive Robert McNamara arrived in Washington with a long record of mastering statistics for his own purposes. In World War II, he and other whiz kids had put their talents to great use, calculating the most effective use of bombing by doing target analysis. After the war, McNamara had used his facility with statistics to win almost every internal debate at Ford. Kennedy and McNamara rapidly moved to isolate and to weaken the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Often the Joint Chiefs of Staff did not receive reports critical of the war effort or even objective briefings because of direct intervention by the Secretary of Defense, the President, or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. By the time of the Kennedy assassination, the military had a great extent been cut out of substantive planning for a war. It was expected to fight and win. The JCS policy recommendations were in disarray because each service branch sought to take the lead in the Vietnam conflict, and often refused to support recommendations of other branches. All of these issues, however, were largely obscured by the confusing and tragic nature of the events in Dallas, November 1963, less than a month after Diem's assassination.
The Abercast. Occult. History. Conspiracy. Violence.
All right. Okay. Well, welcome to the Abercast. This is John. This is the Battle of Khe Sanh, episode 2. That cold open I forgot to mention was for the featured book for today's episode, and it's called A Patriots History of the United States, From Columbus's Great Discovery to the War on Terror. It's by two guys, Larry Schweikart and Michael Allen. So we're gonna get back into that book later, but I'm just gonna set it aside here. Hey, so regular boat rules apply. I encourage you guys to rate and review on iTunes or wherever you're getting the show from. Any help would be appreciated. You could check out stigmatastudios.com or abercast.com. Check out the comic book stuff. Check out the podcast stuff. If you're interested in this topic, in the featured topics link in the Abercast section, there'll be a collection of shows that link into this either directly or tertiarily. So thank you for that. Also at the bottom of the website is links to my social media. Please hit me up. Hit me up on social media. And there was one other thing. Oh, Patreon. Not a whole lot of stuff going on over at Patreon right now, but I'm hoping to change that. The first goal that we have over there is to start a Books for Soldiers program. I've been calling it Make America Weird again, so I'm hooked into like these two organizations that post, these deployed units and what kind of books they're looking for. So I thought that would be a fun thing for us to do as a community, is help these soldiers get some books. The problem is books cost money, they're heavy, and I need to get a P.O. box. So I have the first goal up there is pretty paltry. I can't remember what it is right off the bat, but if you guys are interested in that, or if you're just looking to get the oath printed on a mason jar so we can all have a drink together at the evening when we listen to these shows, or smaller things are bookmarks, and also I'm working on a shirt. So, speaking of the mason jars, now would be the time for you to go ahead and grab that formula that I've given you so often, the formula for mass distraction, the Jin Jihad. Go ahead and mix yourself up a drink. Put your earbuds in. Get ready, because we're going back to Vietnam. So, I thought it was interesting, and I thought we kind of should go back and kind of examine the beginning of the war. That's why we read the chapter out of A Patriot's History of the United States, from Columbus's Great Discovery to the War on Terror. It was interesting. It just kind of backed up the shit that I was talking about in the the first episode about this DM and Kennedy stuff. I thought that maybe it deserves a little bit more of an official account than what I gave you. So there you go. That's from the history book. So where we left our Marines in Khe Sanh. They were getting the shit shelled out of them, and that's where we stopped. And I need to let you guys know that the Marine countered with massive artillery strikes back. So they're just sharing shells back. If they're just trading shells. So our Marines had support from giant 175 millimeter guns from one battery that was 17 miles away and another battery that was 12 miles away. They were also using, they were using direct and indirect fire with artilleries, mortars, and planes. They had planes flying, doing bomb runs. There's some reports that they were running 600 flights a day to support these guys, just hammering. And so you gotta just understand the amount of just bombs and firepower they were throwing down. It's pretty amazing. And the guys that were there were actually the guys that were there doing the mortars. So the mortars are like that tube, and when you drop the round into them, you hear that boom, and the round goes up and it will land. They were firing so many of these things that their tubes became red hot. So, obviously you don't want to drop an explosive into a red hot tube, so they had to cool the tubes down. And at first they used the water that was in their canteens to cool the tubes down. And then they're like, okay, well, bust open some sea rations. So they were opening up cans of fruit that they had and cooling the tubes down with fruit juice. And then eventually they were like, get the platoon up here, line them up. And they just had these Marines lined up just pissing on these tubes. And I think that is pretty gnarly, pissing on these tubes. All right. So we're going to go back to our battle for, we're going to go to the battle for Khe Sanh. This is the book from last episode, written by Captain Moyer S. Shore, the 2nd USMC. We're going to go back to this. As January drew to a close, the situation at the Khe Sanh could be summed up in 3 words. Enemy attack imminent. The result of rumblings of large-scale communist offensives through South Vietnam was scheduled. The Vietnamese Lunar Year, which is the Tet ceasefire, it would be canceled, and I Corps and the 26th Marines braced for the inevitable. While they waited, they filled sandbags, dug deeper trenches, reinforced bunkers, conducted local security patrols, and in general established a pattern which would remain unbroken for the next 2 months. The NVA also established a routine as enemy gunners daily shelled the base and the hill outpost while assaulting units probed for a soft spot. Thus, the two adversaries faced each other like boxers in a championship bout. One danced around nimbly, throwing jabs, and the second stood fast, waiting to score the counterpunch that would end the fight. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. When the communists launched the Tet Offensive on 30 January, they struck in force almost everywhere in South Vietnam except Khe Sanh. Their prime targets were not military installations, but major population centers, 36 provincial capitals, 64 district capitals, and 5 autonomous sites. The leaders in Hanoi were apparently becoming dissatisfied with the attempts to win the South by protracted war of attrition. They decided on one massive stroke to tip the scale in their favor. Consequently, the enemies unleashed some 62,000 troops, many of whom infiltrated the city disguised as civilians in hopes that they would foster a public uprising against the central government and encourage mass defections among the Republic of Vietnam armed forces. Virtually all VC main and local force units were thrown into the initial attack, with the exception of Hue and Da Nang. NVA units were generally committed a few days later to reinforce the assault troops. So we're going to run back to this history book to talk a little bit about the Tet Offensive after this. All right, back to this book, Patriots History of the United States. We're just going to jump in the middle of this chapter here, talk about McNamara. McNamara took his technical solutions to an absurd level when he proposed building a giant electrified, reinforced fence across the north-south border to stop the flow of supplies. Quick fixes, technology substituted for sound warfighting doctrine. Was what Clark Clifford, McNamara's replacement as Secretary of Defense, found when he arrived on the job in '68. When he started, Clifford said, to find out we have no military plan to end the war. By that time, U.S. troop strength near 470,000 and casualties mounted. One massive problem that Johnson tried to ignore was the Allied forces were not just fighting Viet Cong rebels in black pajamas, but also a large, well-equipped People's Army of Vietnam. It was the PAVN, the North Vietnamese Army. The troops received their supplies from no less than the Soviet Union itself, and they delivered them to the south along the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail, a more than 350-mile pathway through the jungles of Laos, which terminated at strike points opposite Da Nang Air Base and Pleiku and An Khe fire bases. For all these substantial and in most cases debilitating weaknesses, the United States still had to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. The watershed event came with the so-called Tet Offensive on January 31st, 1968, when the Viet Cong assaulted multiple targets throughout the South. VC troops even reached a U.S. embassy in Saigon, where they, contrary to popular movie renditions, were killed to a man. They stormed the old capital of Hue and surrounded the U.S. base at Khe Sanh. They made spectacular gains, but at great cost. For every American soldier or Marine killed at Khe Sanh, 50 North Vietnamese died, a ratio approaching the horrendous slaughter between the Spaniards and the Aztecs in Mexico, or British and Zulus in South Africa. At Hue, they surprised and outnumbered U.S. Marines, evicted 10,000 Viet Cong and Vietnamese regulars from fortified city in less than 3 weeks at a loss of only 150 dead. From that point on, any pretense that Vietnam was a civil war was over. The only hope the communists had to win was to come from a direct and heavy infusions of troops and supplies from Hanoi, Moscow, and Peking. At Khe Sanh, nearly 25,000 air sorties subjected to the seasoned North Vietnamese attackers to a merciless bombardment, killing 10,000 communists compared to 205 Americans. One senior American general called Khe Sanh the first major ground battle won almost entirely by air support. But think, what? Who said that? One senior American general. Must have been some Air Force dude. The U.S. Do they have generals? I don't know. A U.S. military historian, Robert Leckie, referred to Tet as the most appalling defeat in the history of the war. For Hanoi, an unmitigated military disaster. Even General Tran Van Tra A top-ranking communist agreed, quote, "We suffered large sacrifices and losses with regard to manpower and material, especially cadres at the various echelons, which clearly weakened us," unquote. This is actually one of the speculations when people talk about Khe Sanh, is that the commies signaled their attack at Khe Sanh so far in advance. So when Westmoreland decided to redeploy and he starts sending reinforcements to Khe Sanh, the idea is that the commies signaled their attack of Khe Sanh so early, so these redeployments, these reinforcements coming in to defend these hill outposts, they were drawing them away from these other targets. I don't know if that's right. I don't know if that's true, because it doesn't seem like a lot of these targets were military targets. I don't know, but that is what some people say. Some people do say that. So I'm not sure. What do you think? I don't know. Back to the book. Yet the very failure of the communist Tet Offensive illustrated the flawed nature of U.S. strategy. Here, in a single battle, Americans had achieved a 50-1 kill ratio, and yet the media reported this as a communist victory. Embassy in Saigon captured, read one erroneous headline. Television repeatedly showed a photograph. Television repeatedly showed a photograph of a South Vietnamese police chief, Nguyen Ngoc Loan, shooting a man in the head, claiming this man was a Viet Cong suspect. In fact, the man was a Viet Cong colonel in civilian clothes, a man Loan knew personally, and by the rules of war, a spy. Andrew Jackson had done almost the exact same thing to British agents more than 120 years earlier, but Jackson did not have to deal with the power of television or the impact of the camera. Scenes were cut and spliced in studios into 30-second clips of Marines in body bags, with the accompanying text, "American troops mauled." After Tet, the most trusted man in America, Walter Cronkite, CBS News anchor, told his viewers that the war was unwinnable. You know, an interesting fact about Walter Cronkite is, you guys have heard about this Bohemian Grove in California where all these elite people go to, like, dress up in drag and get drunk. Imagine. But anyhow, they do this cremation of care. It's like a summer camp for like super rich elite people, politicians and whatever, and news people. And they go there and they wind up dressing in drag and singing songs and just whatever they do. But they start their whole vacation off with this ceremony, which is a little on the creepy side. It's called the cremation of care ceremony. And it all takes place in front of like this giant statue. So it looks like a statue. It's actually not a statue. It's like a hollow, like concrete structure. So I guess it is a statue, but it's not like carved in stone. It just looks like it's carved in stone. You know what I mean? Anyhow, so it's in front of this like pond or this estuary, and this little coffin floats in the middle of it, and a lightning bolt like strikes it or something, and it catches on fire. And this giant owl, like idol or whatever, is talking to them. And here's an interesting thing about Walter Cronkite is he plays the voice of this cremation of care ritual. So it's really hard to find videos of it or whatever, or like audio of it. But if you can, it's Walter Cronkite is like narrating this weird ritual of America's elite dressed, I imagine that they're like dressed in robes. They got like their little picnic baskets. They got the little picnic baskets with them, and they're like, okay, who's got the good pot this year? and, and they're watching this giant owl statue shoot lightning bolts at this little boat, like catching it on fire and stuff. And it's like, yeah, okay, I understand it. I can break down the symbology of this ritual enough to like understand, but at the same time, it's just hilarious. It's so funny, and people run with this, and people are like, "Oh, it's the Illuminati." It's just funny. But there you go. There's Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, who's playing the voice of an owl in a secret Illuminati ritual. But you can catch that. Like, if you go to YouTube, you can catch Walter Cronkite declaring that the war is unwinnable. And every time I see it, man, I just was like, I wish I could just jump back to 1968 and kick that old fucker right in the face. Where was I at? I lost my whole fucking train of thought. Even Newsweek, hardly an objective patriotic source, admitted that for the first time in history, the American press was more friendly to its country's enemies than it was to the United States. Ironically, the polls showed Johnson consistently drew higher support when he turned up the pressure and when he restarted the bombing of the North before the 1968 election. Polls showed that no more than 20% supported withdrawal, and at some of the 20% represented hawks who were dissatisfied with the apparent lack of conviction in the strategy. Now, it doesn't say this, but also, like, the Wikipedia page has this. I tried to find the actual memo, but McNamara actually floated to the Joint Chiefs and to Johnson the use of nuclear bombs in Khe Sanh. I thought that was fascinating. I tried to track it down. On the Wikipedia page, it says that memo was declassified. I could find something saying that it was reclassified, but I still couldn't shake it out. And like, I didn't spend a whole lot of time on it, but I did try to find it because I thought it was fascinating. And Johnson, I mean, you could tell, like, even with just the quick times he was mentioned in this episode, like, he was gun shy. He's actually quoted by saying, like, "We're not going to the North and dropping bombs." That sounded more like Nixon. I don't know. I'm not a good impersonator. I'm not a good impressionist. You know what I'm saying? Back to the battle for Khe Sanh. A sudden onslaught initially achieved surprise, but the final analysis, the overall military effort failed miserably. Allied forces reacted quickly and drove the invaders from the cities and towns, killing approximately 32,000 as of 11 February. Hardcore guerrillas and North Vietnamese soldiers in the process. Many Viet Cong units with no other orders than to take their initial objectives and hold it until reinforcements arrived were wiped out completely. Ironically, these elite cadres were the backbone of the guerrilla infrastructure in the South, which the communists up till that point had tried so hard to preserve. In Saigon and Hue, die-hard remnants, yippee-ki-yay, held out for several weeks, but for the most part, the attacks were crushed within a few days. The general uprising and mass desertions never materialized. On the contrary, the offensive tended to galvanize the South Vietnamese. So there you have it. There's the truth about the Tet Offensive. You know, if you watch these Oliver Stone movies, you don't get that. So, back to our discussion about Khe Sanh specifically. Intelligence was rolling around that would indicate that more NVA troops were moving into the area. The total number, besides the two divisions that were there, the total number would be like about 40,000 troops. February 10th, a commie newspaper started talking shit. They were saying the U.S. faces a defeat worse than Dien Bien Phu. The supply drops were going in full effect. Logistics, fuel, medical supplies, ammo, building supplies, even mail was being sent. And this is when you talk about the supply train, like, in the Army, it's, when it's in wartime, your senior NCOs in any element they are concerned with logistics. I'm not saying they're sitting around hashing out logistics, but they're the guys running these beans, bullets, and Band-Aids. So it's like the tops and the first sergeants, they're the ones that are organizing the distribution of these things. So you have, what I said, bullets, beans, and Band-Aids. The whole month of February and March. The only reason I mention that is because I made such a big deal about logistics and the supply train in the first episode. So I just needed to tell you that they were running when they were working up to this mission, when they were preparing for it. Westmoreland had these pilots doing supply drops. Even though they didn't need to, they had a supply train on land. They had an airstrip where these guys could physically land before they were like taking all this heat and all this fire. But he had them training, doing these supply drops to get the dudes on the ground, get them to have a method in place to like locate and claim these supply drops, and also to train the pilots, for any weather condition, just arbitrarily let them fly and get supplied via these drops. And so this stuff really paid off for them. All this preparation, all this logistics preparation really paid off. And this is really the reason that these guys held in for 77 days, amongst this. And when this, senior American military general is like, this is the first major battle that was won, almost entirely by air support. You really have to think, like, it's easy to say when you're not on Hill 861 South getting shelled the shit out of for 77 days. Like, it's impossible for that guy to have said that with any kind of intellectual honesty, because if those guys weren't there, the Vietnamese wouldn't be attacking those hills. So it's part of it. It's just like when it's just like the weapons of mass destruction thing. We'll debate, and I will debate with you whether or not there were weapons of mass destruction or not, but for all intents and purposes, that's not actually the point of that statement. What I'm saying is so we were in a situation where people were coming over to kill us, to kill people, to kill Americans. And so it seems to me like somewhere someone made a decision that was like, hey, they want to kill Americans. Let's send Americans over there. So if you want to fight Americans, you don't have to come all the way to America, because there's American soldiers right there in your fucking backyard. You can worry about killing those motherfuckers. You know what I mean? So it seems like that's the same sort of mentality where they're like, you want to fight? Okay, I know exactly where to fight. Okay, so there's an interesting thing about Laos. So, we talked about this in the missing Vietnamese POW episode, where it's speculated that some of the reasons that we didn't get all of the POW pilots back was because they got shot down over Laos. And you remember in the last episode we were talking that Laos was supposed to remain neutral. However, the NVA troops were using these caves and this cover in Laos to fire artillery over to Khe Sanh. So, I mean, you have to see, like, this is one of those things where it's like, nothing is black and white. So if you're using Laotian cover to shoot artillery at Khe Sanh, you're kind of opening yourself up to business, whether you intended to or not, in my opinion. Military intelligence is telling everyone that a major attack is imminent. they're saying the major attack is imminent, but the enemy can't get their shit together because of this heavy bombardment. They try 5 times in battalion strength elements to assault these outposts, but the Marines still have the high ground, and they repel the attack each time. So it's another thing we didn't talk about. This guy, I guess this guy really burned me. He really grinded my gears when he was like, it was the only battle I ever won with using almost all air support. So because also the reason that it was won is because these Marines held the high ground. Now you have to remember, in the first episode we were talking about in Dien Bien Phu, they were, it seems to me, from what I can see of it, it seems that those Frenchmen were in the valley. They were not controlling the high ground, which is the whole point. These Marines took these hills at the beginning of our story. So these Marines holding the high ground is important. I don't know, when you hear, I have the high ground, probably a whole generation of people thinks that's a Star Wars reference. Wait a minute, Etienne. I have the high ground. I'm gonna backflip over you and cut off your legs and one of your arms, or your arms and one of your legs, or all your arms or all your legs. I can't remember how it went down, but it's not a Star Wars reference. It's a reference to a military axiom. It goes back to Sun Tzu again. You want to possess the high ground at all times. This is Gandalf coming down this is Gandalf and Perry Farrell coming down the mountain with the sun behind them, to fight at what was it? Helm's Deep. You always want to have the high ground. And that's what these Marines controlled, the high ground overlooking this route. And it made it, I'm not going to say it made it easy, but it certainly gave them the advantage when they started trying to attack, especially in battalion strength. Now you see that they have some look when they do like squad level, like they're sneaking in and out of the wire, when they're sneaking. But when they try to attack in like a battalion or higher level strength, these Marines just have the high ground and just fucking destroy them. Soon they start to deepen, the Marines, they start to deepen these patrols, seeking out the enemy. They're like, there can't be that many of them left. Well, come on, Pilgrim. So I'm going to... So I found this interesting thing on history.com. This is like the History Channel thing, history.com. During the 66-day siege, some say 77, some say 66. I didn't do the math to figure it out. U.S. planes dropping 5,000 bombs daily exploded the equivalent of 5 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs in the area. The relief of Khe Sanh, called Operation Pegasus, began in early April as the 1st Cavalry Air Mobile and the South Vietnamese battalions approached the base from the east and the south, while the Marines pushed westward to reopen Route 9. So they had all the shelling and stuff destroyed bridges, and a lot of these bridges had to be rebuilt, making their way back up to Khe Sanh. So imagine these Seabees or these combat engineers feverishly building these bridges so the reinforcements could link up to these Marines. The siege was finally lifted on April 6th when the cavalrymen linked up with the 9th Marines south of Khe Sanh airstrip. The final clash a week later was a 3rd Battalion, 26 Marines drove enemy forces from Hill 881 north. General William Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, contended that Khe Sanh played a vital blocking role to the western end of the DMZ, and asserted that if the base had fallen, North Vietnamese forces could have been outflanked Marines' defenses along the buffer zone. Various statements in the North Vietnamese Communist Party newspaper suggested that Hanoi saw the battle as an opportunity to reenact what, everybody, I've been telling you this the whole time, reenact its famous victory at Dien Bien Phu when the communists had defeated the French in the climatic, decisive battle that effectively ended the war between France and Vietnam. So, there we go. So as the boys were pushing out, they found empty enemy positions. The NVA had quietly pulled out and retreated, and the siege was over. When it was all said and done, there was about 10,000 dead commies on the field, and there were fewer than 500 Marines dead. And I hate like doing that score or whatever, but you know, that's the nature of this war specifically. Was, you know, they would show these numbers on the fucking nighttime news every evening. So we're kind of trapped with that way of looking at this at the Vietnam War in particular. But anyhow, I thought it was interesting. I thought it was an interesting battle to look at. I thought it was cool that I could kind of outline the importance of logistics rather than tactics. And I thought it was interesting to get into this Patriots History of the United States book. So I don't know. What do you guys think about it? What do you guys think about the information that I give you? Is that what you get when you watch Hollywood movies about Vietnam? Is that what you get when you read whatever you read about Vietnam? I just thought it was more important. I thought it's more important to know more about Vietnam. I think, like everybody knows about the Gold Watch story in Pulp Fiction. You're like, wait a minute, John, what do you mean? What does one thing have to do with the other? Well, the Gold Watch story is a allegory for the Vietnam War. And shame on you if you don't know that. Wait, what? You want me to talk you through it? No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do it. At least not right now. What do you guys think about that? Do you think I'm full of shit? The bloody Hanoi pit of hell. So, I'd like to encourage you guys to rate and review the show wherever you listen to, especially on iTunes. A lot of reviews pouring in lately, and I'm digging it. A lot of, I actually spent most of a large part of my day today conversing with a listener online that had some questions. I thought that was interesting on Facebook Messenger. So I'm always open to that kind of stuff. And, there was a guy on Twitter asking me some stuff earlier this week. So I'm open to all that stuff. I love all the listener interaction stuff. So please feel free if you have anything you want to talk about. Find me. Check out the website. You can find all my links to my social media on the website, and check out Patreon. Trying to get a Books for Soldiers program going. Need your help, bros. I need your help, man. And then with all that being said, just hang tight. And then after this, we will get into Soda Jerk, fucking fight, and then we'll wrap it up, and we'll see you next week. Remember also to check, if you like this content, you like the topic of this show, check out the website, the Abercast tab, and you'll find I can't remember what I called it. It's like featured topics tab or something. It has all the other shows that have to do with this topic in there. So that's going to be a running thing as long as I can keep up with it. So, so if you're interested in the other episodes about Vietnam or military history, maybe, I don't know, it depends. Maybe I'll throw them all up there. Anyhow, this has been the Abercast, and I have been John Towers.
Vienna, 1683. Today is September 11th, 1683. The mighty army of the Ottoman Empire, led by the savage and radical terror troops of the Dar al-Harb, surround the walled city of Vienna and begin a siege to break the golden apple of Europe and kill, enslave, or convert all of its inhabitants. The valiant citizens stand against the tyrannical army with the steadfast leadership of Count Ernst Rudiger von Stromberg, the help of the ever-living rebel, Cyrus, the Dead Guy, and the hopes of the faraway King Jan Sobieski III and his army of flying hussars. the Vienna 1683 comic, is available right now from Stigmata Studios at stigmatastudios.com and on indieplanet.us. The Non-Standard Squad, 1944. World War II. 3 weird American soldiers are on a search and rescue mission into the oldest and darkest regions of Europe. A cursed, ever-living warrior, Cyrus the Dead Guy. An experimental warbot, Sergeant Lane McCord. An all-red axe, mysterious rogue with a demon-possessed arm come face to face with an army of magically corrupted machine-obsessed elves, a magic hammer-wielding Norse Ubermensch, and a Nazi wizard who is a member of the ancient Dark Order of the Shining Hexagon. The Non-Standard Squad 1944 comic is available right now from Stigmata Studios at stigmatastudios.com and on indieplanet.us.
Tightened up her grip and she made me sick that night. I knew that the whiskey would take up my life. Well, I stand a full 2 inches below 5'9", and every guy here wants to take me alive. So I'll take a shot of whiskey and punch out their lights. The whiskey, it make me wanna fucking fight. I fucking fight. Fuck and fight. The whiskey, it make me wanna fuck and fight. Well, every woman here up in this place, not even the crack of dawn is safe. So I'll take a shot